A warm welcome to everyone. Thank you for joining us for this online presentation organized by the European Studies Association, Australia and New Zealand, ESAANZ, to celebrate the 30 years of our association. My name is Gosia Klad and I am delighted to moderate this event. Before we proceed, I would like to acknowledge the elders, families and descendants of the indigenous people who for many generations have been custodians of the lands on which we are organizing this event today. I acknowledge myself the first people of Hobsons Bay, Yalukit Willum, where I am currently located. I am delighted to chair today's webinar presentation by one of the most vital contributors and co-creators of what is currently called ESAANZ. Professor Bruno Mascitelli, who has over 10 years of active leadership of our association. Bruno has kindly agreed to share the history of the association from CESAA to ESAANZ, to share his expansive knowledge of the history and of the most recent developments of the association, and his presentation will be titled From CESAA to ESAANZ, 30 Years of the European Studies Association in Australia. Before we proceed, I will provide a short bio of Bruno. Bruno lived in Europe from 1975 until 1997, where he was employed by Austrade within Australian consulate in Milan, in Italy. In 1997, he returned to Australia and joined the US consulate until 2000. In that year, Bruno joined Swinburne University and received his PhD in 2005. In 2004, he was voted president of CESAA, as ESAANZ used to be known, Contemporary European Studies Association of Australia, and remained so until 2021. He has published many papers and either co-authored or authored 24 books across a range of themes, including Italian, European political economy, and expatriate voting. In 2016, he was awarded a Jean Monnet Chair. He is today honorary professor at RMIT and adjunct with Swinburne University. The presentation will take about 20-30 minutes, and then we will welcome questions, comments, discussion, and reflections in the remaining time until 7 p.m. Australian Eastern Time. Thank you, Bruno. Thank you for being here. Thank you for preparing the presentation, and the floor is yours.
Thank you, Gosia, also for that kind introduction. And this will be a personal recollection with, as best as possible, supporting documentation. I've been through quite a bit of the files. And until 2000, I was really I was not involved until the year 2000. I was not involved in CESAA, and I'll be using the term CESAA pretty much throughout the whole presentation. So the previous 10 years that I've looked at, I've done so by looking at the files, which were quite revealing and really interesting. I might start with the simple point that the history of CESAA ESAANZ is yet to be written, despite the fact that there have been some partial attempts for different conferences and events. The 30-year milestone is a great moment to which to take stock of what's happened and how we got where we got. And sometimes I sort of say, I'm unsure whether we've done well, or simply through inertia, we survived while others came and went. The emergence of the European Studies Association, but also European Studies per se, had a major boost in the early 90s, not just in Australia, but in many other places, largely on the back of the changed political circumstances in Europe. The end of the Cold War in Europe, the reunification of Germany, the collapse of the USSR, and the approval of the Maastricht Treaty. And one of the one of the events which sort of reminds us there are many aspects of the Maastricht Treaty which are very important, but one of them is in fact the changed term, which went from the European Community to the European Union, which had just become utilised. The origins of European studies in Australia was, the association was through CESAA, largely based around the University of Melbourne, with the prominence of Philomena Murray, who was one of the architects of it. It was established in March of 1991, and its original name was not CESAA. It was actually called the Australian Association for Contemporary European Studies, ACES. This name, this very long name, lasted only for about 6 months, and it eventually was changed at the first AGM in 1991. The association was essentially a breakout of the Australian Political Association. So I'm guessing here, but at one of the conferences, there would have been those interested in Europe. And as a result of that particular mix of people, it found that it wanted its own identity. The name CESAA was then adopted in November 1991, and its first president was Philomena Murray, and the vice president at the time was Walter Veit, who was the lecturer in German language and studies at Monash University. The international gathering of the association we refer to as ESAANZ, which Martin Holland is still to this day vice president, was first organized in February 1992. I hope, Martin, that's correct. And also in 1992, the essay competition that we've been promoting for quite a number of years, we began for the first time. Since we've had an AGM early on, I just wanted to give you a comparable, what was in the bank. In 1992, $2,785 was our income or our expenditure at the time, and we were working on very small numbers. Another aspect which is really important at the beginning of all of this was whether there should be a discussion or even a possibility of an Australasian association, meaning inclusive of New Zealand. CESAA decided that it would go it alone. Now, whether colleagues in New Zealand were consulted on this, I'm unsure. I wasn't unable to find any correspondence on that. But the fact that the discussion happened meant that it was important enough to be considered. And I'm glad that we are now at the point where we've addressed that in 2021, and we are an Australasian association. The other interesting thing that emerged also in 1992, which has continued up until my period, was concern from some Sydney colleagues, particularly John Milford. And I doubt that there are many of you who know John, probably Martin, and maybe one or two others. John Milford, I think, was at University of New South Wales. And in the early days, he was corresponding with Philomena Murray in relation to something to be established in Sydney. The discussion was pretty constructive at the beginning, but very soon the discussion fell out in terms of positiveness, and John Milford started to address the CESAA branch as being entirely Melbourne based. Now, I've tried to get to the bottom of this, and it hasn't been easy, but you can imagine the difficulty on this question that we've faced to this very moment. The Melbourne-centric problem of CESAA and the difficulty of expanding outside, and I'll talk more about this. When I approached John Milford, probably in around about 2015, and he has subsequently passed away, he wrote me a very spiteful email saying, "I don't want to see you, and I don't want anything to do with CESAA. You guys have a colonial approach." Well, food for thought, and for me it was quite a it really shook me, this particular view that he had, and probably had been addressing it. And that made the issue of expanding to Sydney also quite difficult. The other interesting thing, and I came across it in the President's report in 1994, and I'd like to read it to give you a flavour of how the political points were being addressed very differently from today. And let me just quickly read it out. This is on how the EU or EC is being looked at in terms of studying, researching, teaching. And this is what it says. The EU tends to be examined in comparative politics, law, integration theory, and in an international relations perspective in the Australian literature. Themes which concern those who are involved in European integration studies include the implications of the single market for non-EC countries, the impact of EC legal system on international law, governmental policy, comparative federalism, issues of identity and nationalism and citizenship in the context of the EU, power and democratic deficit in the EU, defence and security issues in post-Cold War Europe, the CAP, the GATT, and international agriculture, and Australia's relationship with the EC in the context of its historical relationship with the UK. When I think of what we talk about today, we've moved significantly. Whether it's forward or backwards, it kind of doesn't really matter, but you can see there's a very strong theoretical approach that there was in the 1990s in relation to a whole range of issues, and it was nicely presented there in the 1994 CESAA President's Report. At the third AGM in November 93, there was the announcement, listen to this, Matt, there was the announcement for the best postgraduate essay, which came from Matt Harvey, 1993. Good on you. Congratulations, Matt. And I think you got a nice prize for that as well. In the November issue of 1994 of the newsletter, Peter Morgan appears as the liaison person for Western Australia. And you're never forgotten now. Of course, Peter has moved on from the University of WA and has gone to the University of Sydney. But already in 94, Peter was already a contact point for CESAA. In 1998, the CESAA Review, which was a kind of a quasi-journal, became the official journal, and its first editor at the time, and later on this would be supported by the CESAA committee and by Matt Harvey in numerous occasions, was Remy Davison. And these are all familiar names to all of you, I think. So you can see that once you're in the community, you kind of, you're not allowed to leave. The CESAA newsletter or review, sorry, would be discontinued in 2008 and replaced by the Australian Journal, the Australian and New Zealand Journal of European Studies. The early days of CESAA were very much built around what was happening at Melbourne University and partially supported by Monash. My own impression was that, particularly in the late 1990s, the newly created Contemporary European Research Centre, known as CERC, which many of you would have had something to do with, I got the impression, mostly from the correspondence, that it began to overshadow CESAA. CESAA was like in the back pocket. You would pull it out when you needed it, but it wasn't getting prominence. CERC was now the name of the game. And clearly, if you look at the events, the invitations, the networking, CERC, which came out, which was University of Melbourne, would be very much the main flag carrier of European studies. And this, I think, hurt us a little bit. A concern that I've had since the 2000 period, and especially since 2004 when I took over, was that we always struggled with the European delegation in Canberra. They really didn't understand what CESAA was. They didn't see it as being a natural ally. And we often had ambassadors that would simply ask, who are you, kind of thing, what are you doing? And that was, for me, at times quite insulting, but it's something you had to live with. We have our ups and downs, but not getting any kind of recognition. Certainly not the kind of recognition you got in New Zealand with your delegation. I think you've got a very strong relationship. For us, it's always been difficult, and I think there has been some slight improvements over the early period. One of the controversial moments, of course, was, or for me at least, was how I became the president, which was at the AGM of 2004. At the time, up until the AGM, Philomena Murray was the president. I was the vice president, but I was unaware that there was a change of foot that was going on from the other colleagues on the committee. I was invited 2 days before the AGM to someone's house, and when I walked in, most of the committee was there, all colleagues from Melbourne University. And I was unsure why I was there or what was going on. But I was informed that there was a very strong sentiment that there would no longer continue to be the same president for the AGM, and would I be prepared to take over? Now, I was very unhappy with that for one very simple reason, which many of you would probably not be aware of. And that is that my PhD supervisor was the president, and I'm the student, and I'm about to become the president. And I thought, I'm a goner here. This is not the way I wanted to deal with this, and I'm going to pay for it. And so I was a bit reluctant at first. I was concerned that this is, but unfortunately the colleagues were really just angry. There was a lot of internal, horrible, toxic environment at the University of Melbourne. And it was like just payback. We're gonna get rid of this person. And I decided not to mention the names of the people who were there. But if you go back to the files, you'll probably find out who they are. It was not good. And it wasn't a great way for me to become president. And when the AGM happened, and there was only 5 people at the AGM, so congratulations, I'm getting 17 tonight. I really thought, this is ridiculous. What am I doing here? I want to get out of here. Anyway, I let time go by, and I've always been accused by Philomena for concocting this meeting, and I hope that what I'm saying now can make clear exactly what happened. So I became the president in 2004. Morale was rock bottom, and Melbourne University colleagues were still at war. And so I inherited a situation where very little would be done in any positive way. And I might give you a little bit of a flavour from my AGM report the next year, if I can find it in time. This might tell you something about how we were living through it. Okay, so this is the AGM a year later, and it's my president's report. And not everything here I would subscribe to now, but this is me being pretty angry. It has been a difficult year of change, consolidation, and seeking to implement a new strategy of expansion for CESAA. The aftermath of Philomena has not been easy. Clearly, we have some ways to go before there is a different climate and sense of what CESAA is, and not simply being a small, inward-looking Melbourne University clot. The intention of cutting the apron strings with Melbourne University have in part occurred. Now, there's a lot of things in that statement which are interesting. Melbourne University clot, the morale. I was the only one that was not Melbourne University at the time. I was Swinburne. And on top of everything else, I didn't even have a bloody PhD. So here we have the president, no PhD, doesn't do any research in Europe, became president in very sus, circumstances. I tell you, I was not feeling great with all of this, and I really just tried to just, continue on, soldier on. Okay, and now let me get back into many of the other things that we've done. One of the areas that had its relevance in its period was the production of registers, EU registers. In the days when we didn't have especially advanced search engines and ability to find colleagues across Australia in relation to European Union activities, teaching, research, we took it upon ourselves as CESAA, and so did Philomena when she was around, to produce these registers. And at the end of the day, I think the last one that we did was in 2009, and we produced about 4 or 5 of them. Some of them supported by the delegation financially, and some of them simply done by CESAA as a as a document. If I was to show you the 2009 one, it would be literally this thick. Okay, so it had everybody that taught anything to do with Europe: languages, history, law, politics, economics, everything we could find. Sometimes we divided them in universities, sometimes in themes. And that was to really help ourselves, but also the delegation, because they were trying to get on top of this as well. And I have about 5 copies of the 2009 one, and it's become more of a history item. Around 2005, after I'd been running the association for a little while, we had a significant shift, mainly because of the new members that had come in, and there was the great emphasis on the diaspora and the Balkans. And this was largely promoted by colleagues that came from Victoria University in Melbourne, and especially from a guy called Steve Bakalis. And so we had a small little influx of colleagues who were really interested in Balkans, North Macedonia, and so on and so forth. And really, one of the most interesting aspects, besides having a whole conference on it in late 2004, was that in 2005, in collaboration with the ANU, we supported a conference, which was, I think, a 2 or 3 day conference at the ANU on the Balkans. And one of the incidents that occurred there, and I'm unsure if there's anyone in the audience that might remember this, but the program referred to papers on, on Albania and on Serbia, and there was also a whole session on Macedonia. Well, once the Greek embassy discovered this program, they made an official protest to everybody, probably including the bloody Prime Minister, I don't know. And, how dare the ANU sponsor an event with the term Macedonia? That's not its name. It's got to be called the former Yugoslav Republic. And anyway, at our conference at the EU Centre at ANU, the Vice Chancellor, Chubb, at the time, came to our meeting and effectively reprimanded everybody, the organisers, the attendees, for this violation and this insult to Greece. And you need to redo your program. That's not the name of Macedonia, and so on and so forth. CESAA itself received a letter from the delegation also protesting that we were involved in this event and that we allowed the term Macedonia to be published, freely, and it was incorrect. So you can imagine, the kind of suffocation of debate that this had, and the fact that the poor colleagues at the ANU, felt completely overwhelmed. The Vice Chancellor walks in. The EU Centre in Canberra is not, one of those places that attracts a lot of attention at the high level of the leadership, but they were quite intimidated, and it was a real sour end to our conference. However, still at the ANU, in 2005, as a result of a lot of this fracas and debate that was going on, and especially with the support from Karen Hussey, I'm not sure if there's anyone that would remember Karen, we established a Canberra chapter at the ANU. And I flew into Canberra and, launched the chapter, and basically it was maybe 5 or 6 colleagues who were prepared to support CESAA and build a branch there, and we got the full support of the director of the centre at the time, Simon Bronnett, some again might remember Simon. No, don't shake your head, Martin. Anyway, so Simon was a lawyer and didn't really understand or take too much interest in the EU Centre, but at the time there was a lot of people applying for that job to be the director of the EU Centre at ANU. The chapter did not last too long, but it was a good, a refreshing time for us because again we broke that Melbourne centric stance. A couple of years later, Melbourne University faced some major obstacles again. The introduction of the Melbourne model. So to those of you who are familiar, in 2008, 2009. And what this triggered was, and what one of the victims of this massive restructure at Melbourne University was the closure of CERC, the Centre for European Research Centre, anyway. And this was a major blow to European studies. So whatever I might have said about it up to this point, CERC was definitely a major organization that did some fantastic work. And we were really annoyed, whatever our personal feelings might have been. And CESAA wrote a letter of protest to Glyn Davis. I have the letter with me, and I have his response with me. The letter was, and we also wrote to the delegation and a copy to Philomena, clearly because she would have been the one that would have been suffered the most. And this was a major attack on a really important institute for the promotion of European studies, and we were pressuring the university to rethink. The closure of CERC, which went ahead irrespective of whatever protests, also resulted in the sacking of a number of colleagues who were specialists in their area in European studies. The one that comes to mind is Robert Horvath, who was, his area was Hungary. And I believe he suffered quite a bit as a result of that event. And the way I've closed this item is, after this terrible period, which really ended by the end of 2009, it was the end of an era. A big milestone would occur for us in the following 12 months with the establishment of our journal, the Australia and New Zealand Journal of European Studies. The CESAA review had been struggling for quite a number of years. We were finding it very hard to be a credible journal, and we weren't attracting papers that we felt were right. And in late 2008, Matt Killingsworth, who I hope that people are familiar with his name, who was then vice president of CESAA, he and I, over a coffee, thought, it's time. It's time we did a proper journal, and it would be 12 months in the making. And in the meantime, we were able to connect with Peter Morgan and Natalia Chaban and give the journal some kind of future. The first issue in June 2009, launched at that time, included important articles from Martin Holland and Philomena Murray. So for those of you who are interested, you might want to go and look at that. Issue number 1, 2009, June, and we opened up with a journal on European studies. So that was a major turning point for us, and I think to this moment we still find the journal is our best symbol and representation of our work. In the post-2010 period, things started to develop in really significant ways. There were important projects that were up for grabs, and in particular, and I always forget the name of this particular grant, which saw the emergence of RMIT. We were aware that there were, I think, 5 or 6 projects that were bidding. 3 of those projects had CESAA as a sponsoring organization. Now, we actually had a massive debate in CESAA on whether we should be open to everybody or open to one of the projects. And if you want my personal view at the time, I really felt that the La Trobe University that was supported by Philip Bull and Stefan Au was probably the one that looked like the best option. It had 6 universities across Australia presenting a whole gamut of presentations on different aspects of the European Union, and they were all sent around via email, or if it was too big a file, it would be. And they interviewed ambassadors and so on. And so we thought that this looked like the best option at the time, and we were a co-partner. And as it turned out, RMIT got it. I didn't know who Bruce Wilson was, and when I heard of the title of the project that the EU Centre had presented, we just shook our heads and said, "How could this have won?" the EU is not even mentioned in the title, or something like that. It just seemed quite distant. But clearly, what was going on was Brussels was looking for outreach, and not just everybody in their own little space of the European Union. And so, as a result of that victory by RMIT, a very close collaboration was established. It took a couple of years, and I could see that this was a collaboration that was really important to CESAA, and I think history tells us that that's the case. In that period, we started seeing quite a bit of academic discussion, literature, debates on the Treaty of Lisbon, and also bringing out from that the fact that the EU was, as a result of the failure of the referendum, the referendum failures on the Constitution, a desire by elements within the EU to become a much stronger executive organisation, which the Treaty of Lisbon provided. It also provided something that nobody talked about at the time, was Article 50, which would become a little bit more popular around about 2016, and I'll get onto that. Working with the European Community Studies Association, so the Brussels collection of all of the European Studies Association, was really important, especially for me. It's also how I got a better connection and relationship with Martin Holland, but also many other colleagues that were running associations in other scenarios. And in that period, we started, Usap had become already mainstream in terms of our involvement. I probably was distracted by events, and I think not knowing the leadership of Usap, there were a few years where we really sort of just abstained. We just stepped back and didn't really get involved. I wasn't too sure who in the hell Usap was at the very beginning, and that was probably my fault. What we also started to do was finally bid for projects. And so from about 2012, 2011, we started to be successful. And these projects started to be really of real value to us, not only financially, but also in terms of profile, up until the very last one with the Teaching the Teachers, which we were awarded in 2019. The issue of the Brussels projects, in a conversation with Gosha the other day, it looks to me that the idea of using and of submitting as teaching modules may well be the way to go, and there's no reason why we couldn't do it. But this is a conversation we can have offline. CESAA also started to feel a lot more confident to doing conferences as the voice and the location for everybody and anybody interested in presenting work on European studies. Over the decades, we probably did one conference every 2 years, and there were quite a number of alliances that we tried to get together on. The first Usap conference, correct me if I'm wrong, Martin, I think was in 2014 from the Australian standpoint. And I felt that went well. We did our first workshop in Sydney in 2017, and then the 2019 conference was also very, very successful. An interesting event that myself and Bruce and a few others were involved in this period was in 2014 during the G20 meeting in Brisbane. Now, what we had there was the G20 plus the European Union leadership. And as a result of that meeting, we can now pinpoint that that's where the first discussion of the free trade agreement with Australia acquired some public airing. Initially, David Cameron, speaking to the Joint Parliament, raised the issue of the free trade agreement with Australia. It was mentioned by Angela Merkel, and I'm pretty sure also by the French president as well. So we can probably say that was a trigger for the for the free trade agreement, and then very soon after, Tony Abbott effectively launched it. In the last few years, I think what I've been really proud to see was the stabilization of the journal. It's a good size. It's got strong leadership and committed members, and we now have a guideline charter for its management, which is very important. That wasn't there until last year. Of course, with all of the good, there's always some concern, and the decline of European studies in Australia also impacts the association. And when I say decline, I mean as a course curriculum, especially in the Australian universities. The ANU, we know, has had some difficulties. A couple of the top leaders also have moved on. University of Melbourne is is certainly not making any noise about the few areas that they're teaching in European politics. Monash EU Studies has really never been anything that was to crow about. My own university I think, has thrown it out since I left, and I'm hearing very similar problems in New South Wales universities. On the back of this negativity, of course, was the rise of interest in Europe and indirectly European studies with the Brexit events. Of course, most of the interest was with the UK and the shenanigans that went on, but there was a bit of a blip in relation to more interest. However, it's based on something quite negative in relation to the disappearance or the exit of the UK from the EU. A very important moment for us occurred with the initial setting up of the Sydney branch in 2019-20. This was one of the objectives that has always eluded me and eluded the association. And our first steps, we've tried numerous times, and hopefully this is the best one that we can do in getting a branch in Sydney, because it's just unjust given the talent, the interest that exists in Sydney, and Sydney is the biggest city in the country. Of recent, I've been a little concerned about losing funding access to a whole range of projects, and I note from the AGM that this is a matter of concern. I've got a slide which says desires and biggest regrets. My biggest desire, or my desire, is that we might want to consider doing a special issue of the journal for the 30 years, the anniversary of the association. What I don't want to do is simply have it with one paper. So if we feel that there is genuine interest and that there are multiple colleagues that would be happy from their own perspective, that's fine. We really do need to give some thought to that. My other regrets, not gaining the respect and attention from the EU delegation, and maybe that will continue. I'm sorry, Gosha. You know, you just have to be aware of that and make every effort. I'm also sort of regretting that we've lost the engagement of Melbourne University colleagues. I don't mean you, of course, but you know, the people who have sort of come after, and we're struggling to get their interest. And my last main regret was that we failed to establish a Sydney branch earlier. That's been a big loss. I'd like to end with and most colleagues will not be aware of this, but I had planned on doing this whether Martin was present or not, and that is we lost the president of the Thailand Association, European Studies Association. It's now about 3 weeks, and I know that Usap wishes to remember him. Aparat Patsiri was his name, and I'd like to just briefly read, it's only a couple of lines, what his colleague Bawan Rungslip wrote to some of us in Usap and about this person. It is with deep sadness and heavy hearts that I inform you of the death of a much respected colleague and loving teacher, Associate Professor Aparat Patsiri, who passed away on 28 March 22. Professor Aparat was a founder of our master program in European Studies, MAEUS, at the Chulalongkorn University in 1997 and continued to supervise it for the following decade. He was also the president of ESAANZ Thailand. He was respected and loved by his European Studies colleagues from all over Asia Pacific and generations of students. We all miss him more than words can express. I'll finish it there.
Thank you so much, Bruno. Thank you for amazing trip back in history. I am sure that many of you were participants, active participants, but for the young colleagues who are just starting being involved, I feel like this is such an important part of identity building and belonging to this space, and it's really worthwhile to become part of the history of this association and the bigger collaboration. Thank you, Bruno. That's you know how I think your presentation impacted on me with those reflections. But I now open the floor for questions or comments, or maybe your own perspectives or memories. So please, again, thank you, Bruno, and I invite you to contribute to the discussion. Martin, would you like to add something? Yep.
Yes. First of all,
could you come closer to your microphone? Yep.
You can hear me? Yeah. Bruno, I commend your bravery. Whether recording this is wise, I don't know. But I think you gave a very helpful, insightful, and honest appraisal of some of the difficulties that not just CESAA, but also reflecting New Zealand too, of the early birthing pains of European Union studies. And I think, as you illustrated politely, individuals and personalities really can be decisive in setting tones and progress. So if I have any advice to others in ESAANZ, it's don't fall down that rabbit hole that CESAA was in for a while. New Zealand didn't quite fall to the same level, but still similar internal competitions, shall we say, which is always always difficult. But I would like to say, in terms of something Bruno didn't mention, which I think is really important, is that CESAA sort of existed without a strong support from a university for a funded EU centre, which is something I didn't have to contend with. Here in New Zealand, the New Zealand European Studies Association was combined with the NCRE, other things, other hats that I wore. So we always had a very strong, robust administrative support, which CESAA, certainly after CERC collapsed, has never had. And I take my hat off to you, Bruno, and to the others who've been part of that since then. It's damn hard to do when you don't really have a university backing you up and paying the bills if things go wrong. So thank you, Bruno.
Thanks, Mark.
Thank you, Martin. Any other comments? Stephen, go ahead, just unmute yourself.
Okay. Bruno, I was struck by a number of things, partly because of my own comparative experience. When I joined the board of the Journal of Australian Studies in the 1980s, Bob Besant said to me, the then editor, that anything you try to set up in Sydney will fail if it's already set up in Melbourne, because they just won't tolerate it, possibly if it came from somewhere else. But I'm struck by a number of things. One, the decline of the studies generally, because what's happened in difficult times is the big battalions, being the traditional disciplinary departments, have been happy to knock off the studies. That even includes women's studies, which you would have thought had a lot of PC fashionability, but Australian studies, social studies of science, women's studies, etc. The second was when I set up the Australian Studies Association, I was a tutor at Deakin, and my co-creator was a lecturer at the then West Australian Institute of Technology. And we, at different times, we got a bit of support from establishment people, but we very rarely could keep it because we just didn't have status, the status of the individuals, the status of the institutions. And when the Australian Studies Association was reshaped in the 1990s with my support as the International Association, basically run by people from the group of 8 universities, they sort of made declarations like, "Oh, we're now international, and we never used to be," which is absolutely not true. So it's a bizarre one. I do remember when with CESAA, we tried to get the Monash people to be more involved, because there's been a centre at Monash and several European studies people, but it's characteristics of Australian universities. There are still status systems, regional systems, pecking order systems, and I think it's great that we have at least got some developments in Sydney, and including the key role of Peter. So, and I'm pleased that we've got our Trans-Tasman achievement. So we have actually achieved quite a lot, and you've done an amazing job in a holding on operation, because at times, you had a fluctuation in the people who were involved. My system cut out just before you got to the meeting in the House, so I'm sure I missed something gruesome there. But that's a comparative remark, but also the whole matter of the studies and in difficult times and difficult times for the humanities and social sciences, and what I call the revenge of the disciplines, if I can use a metaphor in some ways taken from the Weimar Republic. So I hope that's relevant.
Thank you, Stephen. That's a really great context, a bigger kind of perspective on the achievement of the association and Bruno's persistence on going with it, and making sure that it survives. So thank you, Bruno, again. Matt, go ahead.
Yes, Co-Chair. I would like to say a few words in appreciation of Bruno and marking 30 years of ESAANZ. And I'm realizing with horror that I was there at the conception, and I recall going and buying wine and cheese with Philomena for those early meetings. that my first conference paper was at Europe at La Trobe in 1993, and was followed by my first scholarly publication about the contents of my paper on sovereignty and symbolism in the EU in the CESAA newsletter in 1993. I then won the essay competition that year, and then was involved in European studies in various ways. I took a very long time to do a PhD on the EU, and actually got it the year before Bruno got his at Monash, but he'd started a long time after me, so was that. I was then involved in the setting up of the Monash Centre, and getting no recognition for that was a major reason for leaving Monash and going to VU, where I discovered that I missed the golden years of European studies in the era of Brian Matthews, for example, and the European University Institute. However, I discovered that it was just the very year after Bruno took over the presidency that he gave me the opportunity to go to the conference in Japan that was possibly also a USAP meeting. So CESAA and ESAANZ has been very good to me, and I'm looking forward to trying to give back and to continue a lot of the work that you've started. Also going to say that my day job is now Australian constitutional law, and some of this discussion tonight has reminded me very much of the goings on before Federation, that New Zealand was invited to take part but declined, and that it was because Melbourne and Sydney couldn't agree who would be the capital that Canberra was chosen. So now we need to recolonize there as well. I've unfortunately got to teach at 7, but it was a privilege to hear your words, and wanted to move a vote of thanks to Bruno for his presentation tonight and for his work with CESAA ESAANZ.
Thank you. Thanks, Mads. Thank you. Anyone else would like to, and thanks, Peter, for joining us if you have to leave soon. I think Serena wanted to also comment.
Well, if I was going to comment, it would be just, my experience as a postgrad. I didn't realize, going to those conferences that they were special, if you know what I mean. Like we're always welcome. Postgrads were just as well treated as academics, and it was always a really supportive environment. But because we didn't have the essay competition in New Zealand. So my question would be, do you remember some of that debate about whether New Zealand should be included at the beginning?
Should I go ahead?
Yes, go ahead.
Okay. I wasn't involved in the New Zealand discussion. That was in the early 90s, but I found it in the files, and I found that how it was I think it was decided at an AGM that despite, the feasibility and the good intentions, that the use of Australasia is not appropriate, and therefore, whenever there's a reference to CESAA, it should be Australia. So I think it was dealt with, I think, fairly, and at the time it wasn't seen as a priority. However, and I've said this to Martin in private, that the correspondence that I came across that related to himself and the centre in New Zealand, plus the CESAA colleagues in Melbourne, seemed very constructive, and there were, in that period, possibly it didn't continue, it did not continue, but in that period there was a lot of positive collaboration that went on, and it was noticeable, and I wanted to make sure that I discovered that and came across it, and I mentioned it to Martin. So, but I don't think the issue was ever raised again after, okay, until we came along in 2021. And I need to also acknowledge that the idea of a cross-Tasman association was in a conversation between Bruce Wilson and Martin Holland, which was then referred to me after. That's where the original idea came up. I just want to address very quickly some of the other questions. And I know Matt's probably gone, but Matt is probably one of the people that could contribute to a special issue, given his long long involvement with CESAA, sometimes in and out, sometimes maybe being involved in major activities and then not seeing him maybe for a couple of years. So, but he was certainly one of the early participants. The Bruno persistence. Look, I'm sorry to tell you, but it's true, and I can't tell you how many times I nearly threw the towel in. I did say to myself that at the very worst, there's a journal that can be protected here, but I was not very. I was quite demoralized at times. I'd have a meeting, 3 people would turn up. It was hard to sometimes do activity, and there was also some difficulties in the external world, lack of recognition, lack of acknowledgement, not being informed of a whole range of things. So I felt that it was tough at times. And yes, I did consider shutting down the association a few times. And that would have, nobody would have, said anything. Martin's right. We never had university support except when the CESAA was based around Melbourne. But in the end, it didn't really help a lot, given the trajectory of what happened with CERC and the rest of the Melbourne EU activities. Look, Sydney is really a serious issue, and I know that even the delegation was very frustrated that it was unable to get more mileage and leverage from the universities in Sydney, and no one really has an answer to why this is the case. But I have spoken to people in the delegation, and they've expressed the same kind of frustration more than anything else. And so I still think it's a failure on our part, on not just CESAA ESAANZ, but on others. And I just can't accept the arguments and the reasoning for why it's so difficult. I mean, I think we just have to persist and keep at it. And that would be my recommendation to the new leadership. There was a period, and I really want to go to Matt, which didn't appear very much in my presentation, and that was the period when Pascaline Winard set up a small EU studies area. Effectively, it was really just her and pulling in colleagues from different disciplines and seeking to make a real solid group. But they got betrayed by Monash leadership when they failed to submit a proposal for one of the big projects that everyone felt that Monash would have won hands down. And I think Pascaline Winard, who, by the way, as a result of not participating in that project, had her contract wound up. And so, and then she had to go back to Europe and unfortunately was unable to continue in Australia. So, yeah, so there's little episodes that I'd like to fill in a lot more. And some of the colleagues, I think, can help you do that if we're able to put pen to paper. I'd still like to have people involved in writing papers. I think Matt might be a good candidate, possibly even Martin, if he's happy to give his view of what was going on in the and other colleagues in terms of their own experience. So, and by the way, I found the first reference to Gosia Klatt in 2009 when she joined CESAA as a member. I saw the name on the membership list, and good to see that Gosia. Didn't come to my attention too much until 10 years later in 2019. Yeah, I'm sorry that was the case. Anyway, I better end it there.
Thanks so much, Bruno, for your response. And it's past 7 o'clock in Melbourne, so thank you so much. If there are not any other major comments, again, let's thank Bruno for the presentation, but also for his amazing input into the association staying afloat and really contributing to European studies being recognized as a part of the Australian academic and social networks, as well as New Zealand. Thanks everyone for joining us tonight, and thank you, Bruno, thank you, Martin, thanks everyone. I will hopefully see you at the next event, which is on the 12th of May. It's Europe Day. We co-sponsoring the event with RMIT. You can find more details about the event on RMIT website and hopefully our website. Thanks, everyone.
Okay, thank you.